Celso and Jesus Cardenas are identical twins who were raised together. They remained physically similar as they grew up, but their tastes and interests began to diverge. Celso became interested in dance and academia, while Jesus preferred sports. The most surprising difference between the two brothers is that Celso, wearing black, is gay. The differing sexual orientation of identical twins allows us to investigate one of science's most controversial questions. Are people born gay? Celso and Jesus were raised by the same parents in the same household, so they shared the same environment at a crucial time in their personal development.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great joy to be with you, and I want to tell you, it's so great to be able to talk about the most controversial topic of our time, and that is homosexuality. A gentleman I knew years ago when I was about 18, 19 years old. His name, I'll say, was Tony. It's not his real name, but Tony was very desirous to go to the prom, and as a result, he began to ask some of the young ladies out. Tony had cerebral palsy, and in all honesty, he had a lisp as a result of his cerebral palsy. He began to ask some of the ladies out, and they politely declined. He was determined that he was going to go to the prom, and so as a result, he decided that he would ask every single female in a school of over 1,000 if they would go out with him to the prom. Over 500 women turned him down. Soon after that, Tony said that he was gay. Now, I don't know if there's any correlation or to this event, but I remember thinking at that time, when did he become gay? He asked over 500 women out. Now, to be sure, it could have all been a guise. And it could have all been something where he was finding himself. And to be sure, he had that Freudian dynamic where, in fact, was at odds with his father. And so there was lots going on in his life. But what began to occur is I began to see that homosexuality is multifaceted, and I'm going to give you a term where I'm going to start, and the term is compassionate absolutism. I'm going to tell you I am a Christian, but I have a background in philosophy, and I analyze most things from a logical content. I will tell you, if I was not a Christian, most of the arguments that I hear so far as homosexuality are concerned are emotive arguments, and I would have to blow my brains out to accept them. It has nothing to do with my Christianity. It is merely a statement when I analyze them logically. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the genetic and the epigenetic and some of the logical questions that come up as a result of biological determinism. Well, everybody from Phil Robertson to the new Pope has an opinion on homosexuality and whether it is biologically caused. With the decoding of the DNA, much of behavioral science has moved to a purely biological etiology, signifying that in fact there has been a powerful discovery called, as you all are aware, DNA. Granted, the DNA has modified much of our understanding of human behavior. However, as geneticist John Byrne has noted, if someone comes up to you and says, "We found the gene for X," you can stop them before they get to the end of the sentence. According to neurologist Muriel Beauregard, this is because even minor human traits involve hundreds of thousands of genes. So simple cause and effect genetically probably is a misnomer. So it is unlikely that we will find a gene that creates homosexuality. And let me be absolutely clear. Anybody who tells you that we have found a gene that creates homosexuality has not read the reports, does not know what they're talking about, and is illiterate as to the topic. I will talk about it further. The answer most often mentioned as it relates to homosexuality is that in fact we find homosexuality in animals. That is absolutely true. Since animals do not seem to choose their biology, homosexuality in animals is considered proof that it is a purely biological expression. Of course, no one doubts that there is such a thing as homosexuality in human beings or animals. and on some level expresses itself biologically. And at the risk of being redundant, biology often expresses itself biologically. Yet there's two questions here. The first one is, should we assume that homosexuality is categorically biological because it mirrors animal behavior? Second, even if there is a biological component, does that eliminate all other paradigms? Let me stop here and say, I want you to think very, very clearly upon the difference between component and causation. Let me give you an example. How many of you in this room are male? Raise your hand. All right, then you have an antecedent to criminal behavior. How do we know this? You do not have to confess at this point, by the way. The FBI says there is a biological component to criminal behavior. It's called being male. 90% of all criminals have one biological characteristic. Ladies, do you want to take a guess as to what that is? It's being a male. Now, if you ask me, do males all become criminals? I hope not. I'm one. But if you ask me, is a component to behavior? Yes, it is. And so the difference between component and causation is something that we need to look at. Now, let's begin to go back to our animals. At the onset, we must acknowledge that there's been lots of experiments done on animals in differing brain structurations, particularly as it relates to homosexuality. The reason for this is the human brain sometimes mirrors the animal brain. However, as you might well imagine, the human being is much more complex than any other animal's brain. There are similarities to animals' brain, but the similarities are, to make a point, similarities. In other words, neurologically, not all animal behavior translates into human behavior. Perhaps in the area of sexuality, one might be tempted to make an exception, since sexuality is primarily driven by biological instincts. However, saying that sex is primarily driven by procreation is not the same as saying that sex is exclusively driven by procreation. On a moral level, the distinction between animal sexuality and human sexuality becomes much less ambiguous if we look at another biological response called rape. Thornhill and Palmer did a study and created quite a furor over the study because they theorized that rape was an evolutionary biological response that all animals had. Feminists who believed in naturalistic evolution cried foul, but they missed the point. On a purely biological level, rape might be proven to be one of the most likely behaviors if one assumes biological procreation to be one of the strongest evolutionary life forms. For those of you who are not conversant with evolutionary theory, you have to be able to procreate in order to have evolution. It's one of the strongest indicators in evolution. Therefore, rape might be one of the strongest evolutionary factors that we can look at. Since rape is quite normal in the animal kingdom, and by the way, if you wonder about this, all you have to do is look at dogs and cats. Since rape is quite normal in the animal kingdom, to fulminate against rape presupposes that humans either are not animals or that biology is not always destiny. Otherwise, people with high levels of testosterone should be allowed to rape. In this example, evolutionary drive is presupposed to be subject to something greater than its own basis for being. And the case is clear. You must trump biology despite clear and abiding evidence throughout nature. Perhaps it's better to just admit that nature is not the best place to start for ethical theory. All arguments beginning with the assumption of naturalism end quite naturally in a tautology. Second, environmental factors. Environmental factors were considered to be absolutely taboo in this area of research. Anybody who even suggested that there was an environmental factor to homosexuality clearly did not understand homosexuality, since homosexuality is obviously biological. Well, again, somewhat simplistic. Now, let's talk about this. Well, calmer heads have begun to prevail, and if you begin to study environmental aspects, you're no longer called homophobic, at least not in scientific journals. Perhaps on the street you are, and perhaps in church too. Seth Wells noticed that homosexuals who self-report were 4 to 5 times higher in the area called sexual abuse. This figure is in line with previous studies that report high physical abuse rates and lifetime abuse rates of 36% and 49% compared to heterosexual males. New England Journal of Medicine, again, notice I'm not quoting Christianity Today. New England Journal of Medicine reports that the average age of male homosexual intercourse to be 12.7. For those of you who are not good at math, let me explain what that means. That means there's a whole bunch of people that are having anal intercourse prior to 12.7. Those are children. That would be called molestation. Now, we note that there is a high percentage of molestation, 4 to 5 times heterosexuals among the homosexual community. Correlation doesn't necessarily equal cause. What that means is we could have a component to explaining behavior, but not necessarily causative. Why? Because does everybody who is sexually abused become gay? They do not. But we do find that there is a higher correlation. Perhaps the word that we should use is there is a propensity or proclivity. But a more open and shut case of environmental factors has exploded on the scene. And if you are not aware of this information, I hope to blow your mind today. We have 26 studies showing an environmental factor in homosexuality. We've been studying lesbian adoption and male homosexual adoption. And the party line is that it's not actually possible to increase homosexuality because, in fact, homosexuality is something that is purely biological. Get ready to have your mind blown. 26 studies. Not 1, not 2, not 3, not 10, not 15. 26 studies now confirm that, in fact, the incidence of homosexuality among children who are raised by homosexuals is massively more than the common rate. Now, what is the common rate of homosexuality? Just so we're clear on that. New England Journal of Medicine, again, just so that you know I have some good sources, quotes the figure to be 4 to 5%. CDC, Center for Disease Control, says 4%. New England Journal of Medicine says possibly 5% of the people in the United States are gay. Now, something interesting and may explain my friend. Both agree, the CDC and New England Journal of Medicine, on one factor. Of those who self-report to be homosexual, 50% are bisexual, which is interesting in and of itself. If you're going to say exclusively gay, both agree that the figure is actually 2% of the population. Now, I want you to remember this because I thought about entitling my talk today, Homosexuality and Math, because I'm not sure that the people who are either reading the figures are good at math or that they want to understand the math. So let me help you with mathematics. We said that 2 to 4% of the population, maybe 5, self-report as homosexual. Now, it could be argued that perhaps it's a low figure because people don't want to come out of the closet, so to speak. I'm going to say that perhaps years ago that may be true, but I'm not sure that the current environment is contrary to coming out of the closet. Lots of people seem to be doing it. As a matter of fact, I can't find any born-again Christians on sitcoms, but I can find people from homosexuality in sitcoms in pretty much every one. So I'm not sure that there's a negative environment. But even if there is, remember the figure, 5%. Well, what are the figures for people who are raised in a lesbian family? The lowest figure that we can find is 14%. The highest figure is 47%. This indicates, without question, an environmental factor. People who say that homosexuality is only biologically caused have not read the 26 studies. Again, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 26 that all agree that we can find an environmental factor. Now, having said that, obviously most of the people who are homosexual do not come from homosexual parents. We do not see that previously because, of course, there was a law against such things. However, I'm going to quote Schopenhauer here. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. the thought that homosexuality could be something other than biological. What kind of idiot would say that? Second, it is violently opposed. Whoever says that is a homophobic. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. Schopenhauer was being a little bit sarcastic there. Despite clear evidence of some environmental factors to some homosexuality, we cannot say that all homosexuality is caused by environmental factors. So what occurs is we are looking for documentation for biological causation. Now, I do not have a problem at all with looking at this, but I want to alert you something logically. If we are in fact looking for this, I'm going to say looking more for this than anything out there. You must think this through. Logically, if we're looking, that means we haven't found. Does that help? Do you look for your keys if you have them in your hand?
Sometimes.
That is another area of genetics called dementia. However, we hear things like, and I quote from a scientist who says, neurophysiological studies have documented physical differences between homosexuals and heterosexuals. Here the documentation is interesting. And in fact, I began to read what he considered to be absolutely clear documentation. He said that there was dimorphic differences between male and female brains that show a homosexual anomaly. That male homosexuality has long been hypothesized to be a result of prenatal testosterone deficiency. Now, let me explain something here. All of the talk about homosexuality, if you're keeping current with it, has moved from genetics to epigenetics. Now, let me explain why. Because genetics has blown up and has gone the opposite direction. It is now used against the homosexual argument. Now, many of you thought that there's a gene that creates someone to be gay. No, it's actually just the opposite. Let me explain the history behind it. There was a gentleman who named Pollard and Bailey who did a study that showed up in the New England Journal of Medicine. And basically what the study said is that, well, let's study identical twins. Good reason for studying identical twins, because they have, how much percentage of DNA is the same for monozygotic identical twins? 100%. That's pretty good. Okay? So if you got a gene that makes you gay, we would think that if you got a gay brother, that would mean that you're going to be gay. So he did a study on this. He advertised within the homosexual community, and sure enough, we began to see that in fact there was more people that were gay than perhaps we had originally thought. What was the percentage? He found that 50% of the brothers who were saying they were gay had a gay brother. Same with females. Now, let me caution you here. I'm going to say he probably has found something. But let's be very, very careful as to what he has found. I have seen this in textbooks saying this proves homosexuality to be biological. No, it doesn't. You can't add.
Exactly.
All right, let's do our math again. Okay? If in fact something is deterministic and you do not have a choice involved, then in fact what would the percentage be of people who would be gay if you have a gay brother in a monozygotic DNA? 100%. 100%. Thank you. You're good at math. To say that you found a cause and it's 50% is not the case. Now, what's the highest that we've ever seen so far as something moral being genetic? The answer is the American Cherokee Indian and alcoholism. What is the rate of alcoholism among Cherokee males? 75%. That's massive. Yeah. But is it deterministic? No, because 25% of American Cherokee males are not alcoholics. Do you see? This is math. Okay? Now, we decided that perhaps the study was a little skewed because it was only given to homosexuals. Therefore, perhaps creating a positive result. Therefore, Pilar did another study in Australia of all of the monozygotic twins in Australia. That's a pretty good little study. All of Australia. Okay? He really went down under. Now, what occurred was as he begins to look at this, he comes up with a different figure, 20%. Another study is done in Denmark. Monozygotic twins again, What's the figure? 20%. So I'm going to tell you that 20% is probably a pretty decent figure, at least at this point, because we've got some pretty large studies looking at it. All right, let's do math again. Is 20% higher than 5%? Yes, it is. So I'm going to tell you, I think there probably is something biological going on, but it is not deterministic. Do you understand the distinction I'm making? Okay? I'm going to tell you that every criminal behavior that you can think of, I can probably show you in a biological antecedent. Now here's our problem. We know that people with low levels of serotonin like to burn down houses. I know it's a fiery topic, but we need to go there. Is it getting too hot for you? Incinerator. So what occurs is we know that people with low levels of serotonin like fires. Would you come to the conclusion if they burnt your house down that it was merely because they had low levels of serotonin? Probably not. Okay, let's talk about rape again. We know that rapists have high levels of testosterone. So would you say that someone who rapes you would probably, well, they couldn't help it because they have high levels of testosterone? You would say that, wouldn't you? No, you wouldn't. Now, here's where people get confused in their argumentation, and my logic background comes in. A lot of people will argue, well, that hurts somebody. Okay, I'm sorry, but I have to do logic. You cannot argue a cause from an effect or an effect from a cause. All right, let me say that again. You cannot argue a cause from an effect or an effect from a cause. The effect has nothing to do with the cause. In other words, you can't argue because it hurts someone, it's no longer deterministic. It either is deterministic or it's not deterministic. Do you understand? It either becomes deterministic of behavior or it doesn't. If in fact you show a choice, you have shown the ability to go against biology, or to put it another way, biology is not destiny. This is why we put rapists in jail who have high levels of testosterone. What we're saying is, even though you have high levels of testosterone, you're still responsible for your behavior. Therefore, what we're saying is, and I think correctly, biology is a component to behavior, but it is not the final word on behavior. Can we show any 100% correlations or anything like that in homosexuality? Absolutely not. It's not even close. Therefore, we begun to turn to a new study called epigenetics. Now, why? Because we know that the genetic argument is dead in the water. Okay, let me say that again, just so you're up to date. There is no question the genetic argument actually works against homosexuality. It is DOA. Epigenetics is now the new frontier. Now, this raises all sorts of problems. First of all, epigenetics is a very controversial, very big area in science, regardless of homosexuality. Okay? Because it sometimes passes down to the next generation and sometimes it doesn't. Why? We'll let you know in 50 years. Yeah. Okay? What we know in epigenetics is sometimes it does. But it doesn't seem to alter the DNA structure, which is why it's epi upon as opposed to in. It's not part of the DNA structure, it is upon it. Therefore, you might have phenotype changes of embryonic development, which means that very early on there might be some environmental aspects to the embryo that create some epigenetic changes that might influence behavior. I'm going to say, I think that's probably true. I don't have a problem with that even. And even if you said to me, do you think that there is some biology so far as homosexuality is concerned? I might shock you by saying, yeah, I think the Pollard study does actually show a higher percentage. 20% is higher than 4%. But you haven't argued determinism. What you have shown is, and I'm going to give you a different word, you have shown propensity. Do you understand the distinction I'm making? What you have proven is propensity. You have not proven determinism. Now, is there anything in our studies that show determinism? No, there isn't. Is there any things in our studies that show a component to behavior? I think so. Yes. How do we come out? Where do we end on this? How do we... I've got 6 minutes, so I don't have to end. How do we analyze this behavior? Like every other human behavior. Let me give you an example. It's not just biology where we find propensity and determinism. If I said to you, if you were raised in Catherine Kuhlman's home, is that me? Yeah, okay. although she didn't have any children. Or let's see, Billy Graham's home. Are you more likely to become a Christian if you're raised in Billy Graham's home? I'm going to say yes. If you're raised in a crack house, are you more likely to become a crack addict? I'm going to say yes. But here's the flaw. Do all people raised in a crack addict house become crack addicts? No. Is it a component to behavior? Yes. Therefore, what I'm saying is, I think there's numerous propensities. Spiritual, environmental, biological, cultural, that all impact us. Now, let's look at epigenetics. What are the two big theories in epigenetics, since I have just a few minutes? The first one is fetal distress. And that what occurs is in the womb, there is distress, and the result of the distress creates abnormalities epigenetically that translate to homosexuality. We've disproven it. How? Well, we studied homosexuality in the Netherlands from the 1943 to 46 period. Anybody know what was going on in the Netherlands during that period? German occupation and famine. So if something's going to create stress in utero, famine would be one of them, wouldn't you think? I would think not eating would create stress. If I keep you here 2 more hours, we could prove it.
Maybe 4.
And being under Nazi occupation would create a high level of stress. Is there an increased visibility of homosexuality of children born during this era? No, none whatsoever. It's a pretty strong statement against the prenatal stress syndrome. Now we also have what's called the maternal effect. And it was thought that, in fact, that if you have an older sibling and you are a younger brother, what would occur is it creates stress in the womb for the baby. Now, I don't particularly understand why, but that's the theory. The problem with this is only 17% of homosexuals are the middle child that has been studied and has theorized, meaning the other 83% would not qualify. We've also studied finger length, okay? And you may have heard this one. This is a very, very popular one. And this is based upon the idea that, in fact, prenatal epigenetics creates a scenario in which the fingers are differentiated. We found that, in fact, in some males who are homosexual, there is different, and I'm not going to tell you because you're all going to look at your fingers. Okay. Oh my golly, I knew it. Okay. Okay. Okay, I know how this works. I know how this works. But here's the problem. It doesn't hold at all for females. So first of all, if you could explain it for male homosexuality, there is no differentiation of finger length for females. It's only for males. So it would only illustrate male homosexuality, not female homosexuality. Other studies have debunked it. Not from that vantage point, but just in the studies themselves. They can't find any correlation. In Austria, we did a study of finger length among homosexuals. It didn't bear out. Where do we end on this?
Hairstyles.
Are you trying to say something?
What was your middle one? I'm sorry. You said fetal distress, and then the second one was?
The maternal effect. Okay, all right, maternal effect. Now, where do we end on this? Well, I'm going to tell you, I think that the Pollard study does show something, but it doesn't show determinism. And I'm going to tell you that I think that the New England Journal of Medicine study on molestation shows something. And I'm going to tell you that the church's response ought to be what I call compassionate absolutism. I would have to be brain dead to believe some of the arguments that are being posed. Or I would have had to not read the studies. I hear all sorts of stupid arguments, forgive me, but I'm a logician, and I have this little inner mechanism that goes off when I hear a logical fallacy. And it goes, I don't know if you remember, some of you are old enough to remember Lost in Space and the robot and his arms would wave. That's what happens inside my brain when people do logical fallacies. Logical fallacy about to occur, watch it. And I hear people argue things like, well, Jesus never talked about homosexuality. Okay, logically, this is called the argument from ignorance. Let me give an example as how this works. Jesus never talked about putting cats in microwaves and toasting them. So would you therefore argue it's okay to cook cats? I think it's probably a better argument to say that Jesus is a Jew. And since he doesn't argue against it, it's more likely, though not conclusive, that in fact he's going along with the Judaism of his time. I think that's probably a better argument, even though I would say it's inconclusive. Second point I want to make is I hear people say that they have always known that they're different. I don't doubt that. I'm different. I'm very different. You can tell. I don't mind. But difference doesn't mean gay. I also have no doubt that people have lower and higher levels of testosterone. There was a young lady who was in my class at Southeastern, and she said to me, Dr. Davis, do you know why I came to Southeastern? I said, no, tell me. And she goes, I was tired of being hit upon by every single female on my basketball team, and I want to go somewhere where, frankly, I could just play basketball. If you ask me, do I think that there's a higher percentage of people who have a propensity towards homosexuality if they are on the male side effeminate? Yes, and we've done studies to show it. That's true. Gender identification with objects of playthings. We know that there's a higher percentage of people who, if they're males who play with dolls, who are going to become gay. But does that mean that every male that plays with a doll is going to become gay? No. The same is true on the female side. If you ask me, are there propensities to behavior? Yes. But that does not equal determinism unless I've misunderstood my math. Now, where do we end with this? I used to run a drug recovery center in the church as part of our outreach. It happened quite by accident. All these drug addicts started coming in. I thought, maybe this is like the Good Samaritan. Maybe I'm supposed to do something. You asked me, what did I know about drug addiction? Nothing. One time one of them asked me, how do you know about drug addiction? I said, I know about sin. I don't really know about sticking a needle in my arm, but I know how sin works. And so we ran a very successful drug recovery center. What began to occur is lots of people from the gay community started coming in. I had no idea there was such a high incidence of drug addiction in the gay community. There is, by the way. And so we began to create an outreach for people who are coming from the gay community. The gentleman who led our outreach was a person who people would say is impossible to have. He doesn't exist. He was 42 years gay and became heterosexual. And people would say to me, well, he wasn't really gay. Well, really? I mean, how long do you got to be gay to be gay? I mean, 42 years would seem to me to be a pretty good length of time. But I'm absolutely concerned that we'll go too far in either direction. One, a lack of knowledge. Or two, towards an absolutism that kills people as opposed to saves them. And so what I want to argue for is what I call compassionate absolutism. And so I can tell you, intellectually, determinism has not been found at all. But what I have found is propensity, and I have found hurting people who want someone to tell them, I love you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time to open it up for questions.
You brought up two interesting points. You said a lot of homosexuals are involved in drug abuse. And our presenter the other night said that there is a physical component to drug abuse.
Okay, a component is, I think, is a good word. And we know with alcoholism, there's a very strong component.
So is it possible there's a physical component with regard to the homosexuals?
Yes, I think there is.
Who are in drug abuse?
Have we found it, and does it link to drug abuse? The answer is I don't think that that's been studied at all. If there's a study, I'm not aware of that.
And the second point is you said that homosexuals who are raising children wind up with a much higher homosexual rate for those. Is there possible because there's abuse?
No, I don't think so. And I'm going to say that I think most of the couples homosexual couples who are raising children are really doing it for very noble reasons.
Molestation is not
I don't really think that that's occurring. I think it is really an environmental factor well, that's an environmental factor too. I think it really is more that there is an arena of exploration. There is an attitude of exploration, and people are encouraged to explore. And I don't think the same encouragement is there from heterosexual parents. As a matter of fact, I would say it's just the opposite at most.
I think you almost answered what I was about to say. My twin brothers-in-law are gay, and they were always around my children. I have twin children, and they were always around them growing up. And so my daughter, although she's got a boyfriend and the whole bit, but she tends to gravitate toward homosexual men as friends because that's what she's comfortable with.
Yeah.
So as you grow up, what you're comfortable with, isn't that kind of what you were saying? If you grew up with lesbian parents, then maybe that's where you're comfortable.
I think it's more that exploration is allowed and it's not taboo. And so I think that that's probably why there's more of an increase so far as homosexuality is concerned. Yes, sir?
Well, that would lead to my question. In the studies of the identical twins, monozygotic, identical twins are so close, in many ways, and their environment is structured to do things together. Wouldn't that be an environmental component that would offset some of that 20%?
The answer is sure, and here's where it's impossible to know, which is which. And the idea is there's a search for a epigenetic marker. We haven't found it, but there's a search for it, and the search would underlie the belief of a purely biological, as opposed to anything else. When I say biological, it's a little confusing, because we would consider something that happens embryotically non-genetic, and we wouldn't consider that biological. So it's a little confusing. We would call that an environmental factor. Yes, sir.
Last night, Dr. Matt Stafford showed up some images on the screen of the brain, and it was showing differences of the brain in the homosexuals from heterosexuals. He clearly presented those brain images as a biological reason to clearly state categorically this biological propensity towards homosexuality, and then it as a proven element.
Okay. Let me comment on that. Yeah. All right. First, let's destroy the myth. Okay. And I'll be happy to talk to Matt about this. The first beginning of this talk came from the Salk study, and what occurred is the LeVay study from the Salk Institute, and it found that there were biological differences. Now, I would be interested to know which photographs and where he got them from. Here's why. Because it was printed in I remember reading in the Baltimore Sun on the front page, brain structuration differences prove homosexuality is biological. Well, that was sort of interesting to me, because as I read down further, I found that the number of people involved in the study was 41. Now, my first thought was, either these people don't actually understand scientific studies, or they understand them and it's an agenda. Because to do a study based upon 41 people is amazing, and to put it on the front page. Now, what later happened with the Salk study and the brain differentiation and brain structuration, this is why I'd like to know what the photos are, is that all of these brain structurations that were different came from cadavers. Now, why is that interesting? Well, because all of them were done in San Francisco, and all of them had died of AIDS. Now, why is this a problem? Well, because the particular region highlighted, did he say which region it was? Is it the hypothalamus?
Yes.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
He did mention, he used some from the HIV/AIDS study, and then he said all of those, and then he mentioned that.
Okay, he mentioned that was...
He did say that there was some statistical, I'm not sure what the word you used, but skewed. It wasn't exactly solid.
Yep.
But he did, what Dr. Stanford's point was, and I think it was the same point you're making, is that there is a biological component to homosexual behavior.
I'm going to say this. I agree with him, but we haven't found it. Okay? Now, except for the Pollard study, I think that is evidence of a propensity. Now, having said that, what we found was that AIDS increases the hypothalamus region. In other words, all the brains who had an enlarged hypothalamus region were increased because of AIDS. And further to the point, even people who were not homosexual had increased hypothalamus regions. In other words, everybody who dies of AIDS, one of the effects of AIDS is that it increases the hypothalamus region. The result of that is the study was completely discredited. And I saw a retraction of the study in the Baltimore Sun. And I thought it was very nice of them to put the retraction in on page 4. Yeah, exactly. Now, are we looking at brain structure agents? Okay, since we're on brain structure agents, let's talk a little bit more about this. Yes, absolutely, we're definitely looking at that. And if you ask me, do I believe that there is a biological component to homosexuality? I'm going to say in some cases, yes. Clearly, half the cases, I'm not really sure because they're bisexual. Okay? But if you ask me, is there some biological antecedents? I would say certainly when we're talking about testosterone, like being increased in females and lower testosterone in males, that probably does have an effect upon the brain. Okay? Now, is it enough to, in fact, create homosexuality? If so, the best that it can do is create a propensity. And notice the distinction I'm making again. The best that it can do is create a propensity because there are not any studies out there that show 100% determinism with any biological factors that we can find. Yes, sir?
He said that that part of the brain had not yet that, and I just knew there was too many people, I couldn't get up to it. I wanted to ask him this question, was because he said that that part of the brain that he was showing on the screen had not been emasculinized.
Yeah, okay, this is talking about epigenetics. And one of the theories in epigenetics is that there isn't enough testosterone given to a male and too much to a female. I'm going to say that's a possibility, okay? Remember the illustration, the story I told you about the young lady playing basketball. Okay, well, this is probably a pretty good illustration. She said the majority of people playing basketball with her were gay. I don't doubt that. And I don't doubt that you will find increased testosterone level among female athletes. I don't doubt that. But here's our flaw to all of those ideas. Do all female athletes with high levels of testosterone turn out to be gay? No. Do all effeminate males turn out to be gay? No. And so I don't doubt that there is a biological component, but there's nothing deterministic. And everything that we have found, I will tell you, is very, to use the word, embryonic. Forgive me. I know, that was a pun. No, you didn't get it. You didn't get it or it wasn't funny. Okay. Right. So you won't tell me. Okay. Yes, sir.
Going back to the kids raised in gay families, I heard, I may have missed it earlier, was there also any propensity caused by the absence of the other missing gender in the adults?
Yeah, that's been studied a little bit, and I'm going to say it's inconclusive. We don't really see any strong cause and effect, and we see a lot of missing fathers in our culture, and we don't really see homosexuality raising proportionally. I think is the answer. In other words, going back to 1850 or 1900. The increase in fatherless families is much more than what we had back then. We do not see the same type of increase so far as homosexuality is concerned. Let's see, I think you had your hand next.
Yeah, should our response to this whole thing be that people be transformed from homosexuality to heterosexuality, or that they just kind of go against their tendencies and in their mind they still are tempted and all that, but they never act out on it?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And here I'm going to say, this is where I would allow my Christianity to inform my question. Everything else I'm going to say, I'm going to answer from a logic or scientific background. And here I'm not saying that's contrary to logic, because in all honesty, a morality that begins with me must logically and necessarily end with me, so I'm going to look for a transcendent source. Okay? So having looked to a transcendent source, you either worship a God of revelation or a God of imagination. I choose to worship a God of revelation. The God of revelation says, I think fairly clearly, homosexuality is wrong. Which means even if I have a propensity towards alcoholism and an American Cherokee male, I still am not allowed to become an alcoholic. Or to put it another way, when a person becomes a believer in Jesus Christ, the same power that raised Christ Jesus from the dead dwells in their mortal bodies, and they can have the possibility to be recreated. Having said that, I have married many homosexuals to heterosexual men or women.
I noticed in the conversation, so it's not exactly on this topic, but the negative health risks seems to be totally evacuated from the discussion in the contemporary culture. In other words, the alcoholic Navajo or Cherokee. Obviously, that's devastating to them,
True.
physically, relationally, culturally, and it seems like we overlook the idea, address the idea of overlooking the idea of the physical cost.
There is a physical cost. According to CDC, there's an 800% increase in STDs among the homosexual community. STDs are nasty, okay? One of the things that has occurred, and it's really sort of sad, in spite of all of the warnings about safe sex, there's a couple things you need to know about that. First of all, safe sex isn't as safe as you're maybe led to believe. If used correctly, and we won't even get into what is correct and incorrect use, okay? But if used correctly, there's a 2 to 3% failure rate among condoms. So think this through. 100 times of sex is a 2 to 3% failure rate. Now, having said that, there's an epidemic of young gay men who do not use condoms. As a result, the AIDS epidemic continues to go further, probably because of feelings of, that they're invincible, I suppose, like most 18-year-olds. So one of the problems that we get into is we do have some very, very significant health factors. One that I have studied is suicide. Now, the argument is that there's a tremendous amount of suicide because of the persecution that is given to homosexual people. Well, what is the rate of suicide? For females, the common rate of suicide is 4%, 4.1%. Lesbians, the rate of suicide or attempted suicide is 24.8%. That's a mammoth increase, okay? Now, having said that, let's take up on the idea, well, it's because of persecution. I've studied slavery and suicide. You don't get anything above 10% in slavery. So if you want to talk about oppression, let's talk about being literally beaten. Average age for an American slave in the South, mortality rate 35 years old. That's unbelievable. 35 years old. I mean, it's just incredible. So I'm going to suggest that maybe there's something more to it than just what other people think. It's a mammoth rate. By the way, males are higher than females, just in case you're wondering.
I don't know how much we really want to talk about this very much now, but with the homosexual population and trying to draw them into Christian fellowship, for those that experience salvation, whether it's a one-time moment or they make that commitment over a period of time, how is it that the church could do better in terms of showing compassion while they work through the things in their life that you would like to see change? Many of us have had long-term experiences with teen times, drug addiction,
Yep.
different kinds
Right.
of,
And drug addiction is a perfect example.
This has to be the last question.
Last question.
And yet we are looking for a quick change in behavior.
Okay, I think you've answered your own question, actually, and I think you're quite right.
The question is, sin, what is your greater sin?
Yeah. Okay. The question is, how do we deal with people who, frankly, aren't where we want them to go? And I think that the answer is that's true for everybody. Okay, I was a pastor. Trust me. Okay. And I had a great church, but if you ask me, was everybody where I wanted to be? Absolutely not. I remember a man who said to me one time, I don't think anybody likes me in this church. And I said to him, well, no, duh. And he said, I beg your pardon. I said, you are perhaps the rudest person I have ever met in my life. And he said, really? And I said, yeah. And he said, can I meet with you? And I said, sure. And we started every time that we got together with this question: tell me how you were meek this week. So the answer to your question is, as pastors, we have to develop an environment that had the mind of Jesus as it relates to the lost. I haven't come to destroy them. That's why I'm here. I've come to seek and save them. And while I cannot intellectually agree with some of the conclusions that are told me, in other words, that determinism is my only option, because I'm pretty clear I can prove that wrong, I am going to tell you that I love you. And that the fact that you have fallen doesn't make you any different than anybody else as sinners.
Amen.
Now, your sin is different. But having been saved by grace, I know that but by the grace of God go I. And my only hope, and everybody else's, is that Jesus loves me in spite of all the things that I've done, and that I'm saved solely by His grace. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.